That night, the ship crash-landed onto an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet which circled a small, unregarded yellow sun in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the western spiral arm of the galaxy. In the hours preceding the crash, Ford Prefect had fought furiously but in vain to unlock the controls of the ship from their preordained flight path. It had quickly become apparent to him that the ship had been programmed to convey its payload safely, if uncomfortably, to its new home, but to cripple itself beyond hope of repair in the process. Its screaming, blazing descent through the atmosphere had stripped away most of its superstructure and outer shielding, and its final inglorious belly flop into a murky swamp had left its crew only a few hours of darkness during which to revive and offload its deep-frozen and unwanted cargo, for the ship began to settle almost at once, slowly upending its gigantic bulk into the stagnant slime. Once or twice during the night it was starkly silhouetted against the sky as burning meteors, the detritus of its descent, flashed across the sky. In the gray pre-dawn light, it let out an obscene roaring gurgle and sank forever into the stinking depths. When the sun came up that morning, it shed its thin, watery light over a vast area heaving with wailing hairdressers, public relations executives, opinion pollsters, and the rest, all clawing their way desperately to dry land. A less strong-minded sun would probably have gone straight back down again, but it continued to climb its way through the sky, and after a while, the influence of its warming rays began to have some restoring effect on the feebly struggling creatures. Countless numbers had, unsurprisingly, been lost to the swamp in the night, and millions more had been sucked down with the ship, but those who survived still numbered hundreds of thousands, and as the day wore on, they crawled out over the surrounding countryside, each looking for a few square feet of solid ground on which to collapse and recover from their nightmare ordeal. Two figures moved farther afield. From a nearby hillside, Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent watched the horror of which they could not feel a part. "Filthy, dirty trick to pull," muttered Arthur. Ford scraped a stick along the ground and shrugged. An imaginative solution to a problem, I'd have thought," he said. "Why can't people just learn to live together in peace and harmony?" said Arthur. Ford gave out a loud, very hollow laugh. "42, he said, with a malicious grin. "Nah, it doesn't work. Never mind." Arthur looked at him as if he'd gone mad, and, seeing nothing to indicate to the contrary, realized that it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that this had in fact happened. "What do you think would happen to them all?" he came after a while. "In an infinite universe, anything can happen," said Ford. "Even survival. Strange, but true." A curious look came into his eyes as they passed over the landscape and then settled again on the scene of misery below them. "I think they'll manage for a while," he said. Arthur looked up sharply. "Why do you say that?" he said. Ford shrugged. "Just a hunch," he said, and refused to be drawn on any further questions. "Look," he said suddenly. Arthur followed his pointing finger. Down among the sprawling masses, a figure was moving, or perhaps lurching would be a more accurate description. He appeared to be carrying something on his shoulder. As he lurched from prostrate form to prostrate form, he seemed to wave whatever that something was at them in a drunken fashion. After a while, he gave up the struggle and collapsed in a heap. Arthur had no idea what this was meant to mean to him. "Movie camera," said Ford, "recording the historic moment." "Well, I don't know about you," said Ford again after a moment, "but I'm off." He sat a while in silence. After a while, this seemed to require comment. When you say you're off, what do you mean exactly?" said Arthur. "Good question," said Ford. "I'm getting total silence." Looking over his shoulder, Arthur saw that he was twiddling with knobs on a small black box. Ford had already introduced this box to Arthur as a sub-ether sensomatic, but Arthur had merely nodded absently and not pursued the matter. In his mind, the universe still divided into two parts, the Earth and everything else. The Earth, having been demolished to make way for a hyperspace bypass, meant that this view of things was a little lopsided, but Arthur tended to cling to that lopsidedness as being his last remaining contact with his home. Sub-ether sensomatics belonged firmly in the everything else category. Not a sausage, said Ford, shaking the thing. Sausage, thought Arthur to himself, as he gazed listlessly at the primitive world about him. What I wouldn't give for a good Earth sausage. Would you believe, said Ford in exasperation, that there are no transmissions of any kind within light years of this benighted tip? Are you listening to me? What? Said Arthur. We're in trouble, said Ford. Oh, said Arthur. This sounded like month-old news to him. Until we pick up anything on this machine, said Ford, our chances of getting off this planet are 0. It may be some freak standing wave effect in the planet's magnetic field, in which case we just travel round and round until we find a clear reception area. Coming? He picked up his gear and strode off. Arthur looked down the hill. The man with the movie camera had struggled back up to his feet just in time to field one of his colleagues collapsing. Arthur picked a blade of grass and strode off after Ford. I trust you had a pleasant meal, said Zarnewhoop to Zaphod and Trillian as they rematerialized on the bridge of the starship Heart of Gold and lay panting on the floor. Zaphod opened some eyes and glowered at him. You! He spat. He staggered to his feet and stomped off to find a chair to slump into. He found one and slumped into it. I have programmed the computer with the improbability coordinates pertinent to our journey, said Zarnewhoop. We will arrive there very shortly. Meanwhile, why don't you relax and prepare yourself for the meeting? Zaphod said nothing. He got up again and marched over to a small cabinet from which he pulled a bottle of Old Jank's spirit. He took a long pull at it. And when all this is all done, said Zaphod savagely, it's done, all right? I'm free to go and do what the hell I like and lie on beaches and stuff. It depends what transpires from the meeting, said Zarnewhoop. Zaphod, who is this man? Said Trillian shakily, wobbling to her feet. What's he doing here? Why is he on our ship? He's a very stupid man, said Zaphod, who wants to meet the man who rules the universe. Ah, said Trillian, taking the bottle from Zaphod and helping herself. A social climber. Here we go. The major problem, one of the major problems, for there are several, one of the many major problems with governing people is that of whom you get to do it, or rather of who manages to get people to let them do it to them. To summarize, it is a well fact that those people who must want to rule people are, ipso facto, the least suited to do it. To summarize the summary, anyone who is capable of getting themselves made the president should on no account be allowed to do the job. To summarize the summary of the summary, people are a problem. And so, this is the situation we find. A succession of galactic presidents who so much enjoy the fun and palaver of being in power that they very rarely notice that they're not. And somewhere in the shadows behind them, who? Who can possibly rule if no one who wants to do it can be allowed to? I want to stress to all of you that this book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, the second book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, was published in 1980, 40 years ago. And here we are, 40 years later. That 4-chapter passage to make up chapter 28 in this book. I don't think I've ever heard anything still more relevant today in my entire fracking life.